September 17, 1944. The Dutch countryside near Zaan, Holland lies bathed in afternoon sunlight. German Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner adjusts his field glasses from the church tower, scanning the horizon for Allied aircraft. The distant drone of engines grows louder, not the familiar growl of fighters, but something different, something massive. At 1:31 p.m., the sky darkens with an armada unlike anything Brenner has ever witnessed. Hundreds of Douglas C-47 Skytrains emerge through the clouds, their engines thundering in perfect formation. But these aircraft carry no bombs, no paratroopers preparing for battle. Instead, they tow what appears impossible, massive wooden gliders, each one laden with equipment that defies military logic. Brenner watches through his binoculars as the first CG-4A glider releases from its tow line, descending silently toward the landing zone. Through the fabric-covered fuselage, he glimpses something that makes his hands tremble. Surgical tables, medical equipment, entire hospital wards being delivered from the sky. The Americans aren't just dropping soldiers, they're dropping civilization itself onto the battlefield. What he witnesses next will shatter everything German military doctrine believed possible about warfare. By September 1944, battlefield medicine had evolved far beyond the crude aid stations of the Great War. Yet most armies still relied on primitive evacuation methods that condemned thousands of wounded soldiers to preventable deaths. Field hospitals remained static installations, vulnerable targets that required days to establish and relied entirely on ground supply lines that enemy forces could easily sever. The German Wehrmacht, despite its tactical innovations, maintained a medical doctrine rooted in 19th-century principles where wounded soldiers were expected to crawl back to safety or die where they fell. The transformation of American military medicine began in the North African campaigns of 1942, where Army medical officers witnessed firsthand the limitations of conventional treatment protocols. Dr. Michael DeBakey, working with the Office of Scientific Research and Development, pioneered mobile surgical units that could be rapidly deployed to forward positions. These innovations caught the attention of General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, who recognized that airborne operations demanded revolutionary medical support capable of functioning completely independently behind enemy lines. The 326th Airborne Medical Company emerged from this strategic necessity. Formed in August 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the unit represented something unprecedented in military history, a fully self-contained hospital capable of being delivered by air to any location within hours of combat operations. Unlike traditional medical units that required extensive ground transportation and permanent facilities, the 326th was designed to function as a complete surgical hospital using nothing more than what could fit inside CG-4A gliders. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. How do you compress an entire hospital into aircraft designed primarily for transporting troops? How do you protect delicate surgical equipment during the violent landing sequence of a combat glider operation? How do you maintain sterile operating conditions in temporary structures erected under enemy fire? The solutions required innovations that pushed the boundaries of both medical science and military engineering. Dr. William Barfield, the 326th's commanding officer, worked closely with Waco Aircraft Company engineers to design modular hospital components specifically engineered for glider transport. Surgical tables that could be assembled in minutes, portable X-ray machines powered by compact generators, and collapsible operating theaters that provided the same sterile environment as permanent hospital facilities. Every piece of equipment underwent rigorous testing to ensure it could survive the brutal forces of combat glider landings while maintaining precise calibration necessary for life-saving surgery. The unit's training regimen at Camp McCall, North Carolina became legendary for its intensity. Medical personnel learned to perform complex surgeries while under simulated artillery bombardment. They practiced setting up complete operating theaters in total darkness, using only hand signals and muscle memory developed through countless repetitions. The 326th trained to function as both medical professionals and combat soldiers, capable of defending their patients while simultaneously saving lives under the most extreme conditions imaginable. By the spring of 1944, the 326th Airborne Medical Company represented the culmination of American innovation in military medicine. They possessed capabilities that existed nowhere else in the world, the ability to establish fully functional hospitals anywhere airborne forces could land, completely independent of ground supply lines or permanent infrastructure. Their equipment represented millions of dollars in research and development, incorporating cutting-edge medical technology into designs optimized for the brutal realities of airborne warfare. The German medical establishment, meanwhile, remained anchored to traditional concepts of battlefield treatment. Wehrmacht medical doctrine emphasized evacuation to rear-area hospitals rather than forward treatment, accepting massive casualty rates as an inevitable cost of war. German field hospitals required extensive ground transportation, permanent buildings, and uninterrupted supply lines, luxuries that became increasingly rare as Allied air superiority made ground movement nearly impossible during daylight hours. This fundamental philosophical difference would prove decisive. While German forces struggled to evacuate their wounded through increasingly dangerous rear areas, American airborne medical units prepared to deliver complete hospitals directly to the battlefield, bringing advanced surgical capabilities to locations German commanders considered unreachable by anything more sophisticated than basic first aid. Operation Market Garden represented the largest airborne operation in military history, involving over 34,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops deployed across a 64-mile corridor in German-occupied Holland. The ambitious plan called for 3 Allied airborne divisions to capture key bridges along the route to Arnhem, creating a pathway for British XX Corps to advance rapidly into the German industrial heartland. The 101st Airborne Division received responsibility for securing the southern sector around Eindhoven, including the critical bridges at Sonnenwegel that would keep the corridor open for the advancing ground forces. German defensive preparations in Holland reflected the Wehrmacht's growing desperation as the war turned decisively against them. General Kurt Student's Army Group H occupied strongly fortified positions throughout the region, supported by the remnants of elite SS Panzer divisions that had been bloodied during the Normandy campaign, but retained significant combat effectiveness. These forces had spent months constructing defensive networks designed to channel Allied attacks into predetermined killing zones, where concentrated firepower could inflict maximum casualties. The German medical infrastructure in Holland epitomized the Wehrmacht's declining capabilities. Shortages of medical supplies, personnel, and transportation had reduced German field medical care to its most basic elements. Wehrmacht medical units relied on horse-drawn ambulances and commandeered civilian vehicles for casualty evacuation, while their field hospitals operated in requisitioned buildings that lacked modern surgical equipment or adequate power generation. Most critically, German medical doctrine prohibited forward deployment of surgical capabilities, meaning wounded soldiers faced hours or even days of transport before receiving definitive treatment. This medical infrastructure reflected broader strategic realities facing German forces in late 1944. Allied air superiority made daytime movement virtually impossible, forcing German medical evacuation to occur under cover of darkness along increasingly dangerous routes subject to constant interdiction. Supply shortages meant German hospitals operated without basic necessities like morphine, sulfa drugs, or adequate anesthesia, while personnel shortages forced remaining medical officers to perform multiple specialties far beyond their training and expertise. American intelligence reports detailed these German medical limitations with clinical PI. Precision. OSS operatives and Dutch resistance networks provided comprehensive assessments of Wehrmacht medical capabilities, revealing systematic shortages that reduced German field hospitals to little more than casualty collection points. These intelligence reports influenced American planning for Market Garden, particularly the decision to deploy unprecedented medical capabilities that could exploit German vulnerabilities while protecting American forces from similar medical catastrophes. The 326th Airborne Medical Company's deployment plan for Market Garden represented medical logistics on a scale never before attempted. 60 CG-4A gliders would transport complete hospital facilities capable of performing major surgery within hours of landing. The first wave, consisting of 6 gliders carrying essential personnel and emergency equipment, would establish initial treatment capabilities immediately upon touchdown. The second wave, involving 54 additional gliders, would deliver the complete hospital infrastructure, including advanced surgical suites, X-ray equipment, laboratory facilities, and enough medical supplies to operate independently for 30 days. This deployment required solving logistical challenges that seemed impossible under conventional military doctrine. Each glider carried precisely calculated loads designed to maximize medical capability while respecting strict weight limitations imposed by the CG-4A's performance characteristics. Surgical instruments were packed in shock-resistant containers, delicate electronic equipment secured with specially designed cushioning systems, and pharmaceutical supplies organized for immediate access upon landing. The loading process alone required weeks of careful preparation, with every item positioned to survive the violent forces of combat glider operations. German intelligence networks, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of these unprecedented American medical capabilities. Wehrmacht reconnaissance focused primarily on combat units and heavy equipment, paying minimal attention to medical logistics that German doctrine considered secondary to primary combat operations. This intelligence failure would prove catastrophic when German commanders found themselves facing enemy forces supported by medical capabilities they had never imagined possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate the decisive importance of medical superiority in modern warfare. American forces prepared to deploy hospital capabilities that could save lives at a rate unprecedented in military history, while German defenders operated under medical limitations that condemned their wounded to suffering and death that advanced treatment could easily prevent. The psychological impact of this disparity would prove as significant as its practical implications for combat effectiveness. The human angle of Operation Market Garden's medical component revealed itself in the faces of young American medics who understood they carried responsibilities far beyond their years. 22-year-old Staff Sergeant Robert Chen had trained for 18 months to become a surgical technician capable of assisting in complex operations under combat conditions. His hands, steady enough to thread sutures while artillery shells exploded overhead, represented thousands of hours of practice that transformed civilian college students into battlefield medical professionals. These young men carried with them not just medical equipment, but the hopes of every soldier who knew that American medical care meant survival rates unimaginable under any other flag. German medical personnel faced entirely different realities that reflected their nation's declining position. On in the war. Oberarzt Heinrich Müller, a veteran surgeon who had saved countless lives during the early victories in Poland and France, now operated with supplies so limited that he performed amputations without adequate anesthesia and sutured wounds with silk thread salvaged from parachutes. His medical bag, once filled with the finest German pharmaceuticals, now contained whatever supplies could be scavenged from captured Allied equipment or improvised from civilian sources. The transformation from confident conqueror to desperate improviser played out in every German medical unit across occupied Europe. The technological angle revealed the fundamental difference between American and German approaches to military medicine. American CG-4A gliders carried portable X-ray machines powered by compact generators that provided the same diagnostic capabilities available in stateside hospitals. These machines, weighing less than 200 pounds when disassembled, could be operational within 30 minutes of landing and provided high-resolution images that allowed American surgeons to make precise diagnoses impossible under field conditions just years earlier. The contrast with German medical technology, increasingly dependent on equipment captured years earlier or improvised from civilian sources, illustrated the widening gap between American industrial capacity and German resource limitations. American pharmaceutical superiority proved equally decisive. Each 326th Medical Company glider carried morphine supplies sufficient to provide adequate pain relief for hundreds of casualties, while German medical units rationed their remaining morphine stocks with desperate care. American surgeons operated with access to sulfa drugs, penicillin, and plasma supplies that could prevent infections and treat shock with unprecedented effectiveness. These medical advances, developed by American pharmaceutical companies working in close coordination with military medical research, represented scientific achievements that German researchers, isolated by war and starved of resources, could no longer match. The leadership angle exposed contrasting philosophies that shaped medical care on both sides. American medical doctrine, influenced by civilian hospitals that treated every patient as someone's son or daughter, emphasized aggressive treatment and maximum effort to save every life regardless of tactical considerations. Colonel William Barfield's orders to his medical personnel were simple: provide the same standard of care you would want for your own family, regardless of enemy action or tactical situation. This philosophy created medical units willing to risk their own lives to save wounded soldiers, establishing aid stations in forward positions that German doctrine considered suicidally dangerous. German medical leadership reflected the Wehrmacht's increasingly callous attitude toward individual soldiers as the war turned against them. German medical officers received explicit orders to prioritize resources for soldiers most likely to return to combat quickly, while those with severe injuries were often written off as lost causes not worth scarce medical supplies. This triage philosophy, born from desperate resource shortages, created a medical system that abandoned wounded soldiers who American medical units would fight desperately to save. The psychological impact on German medical personnel, forced to watch patients die from treatable conditions, contributed to declining morale throughout the Wehrmacht medical establishment. The moral angle of medical warfare raised questions that neither side fully anticipated. American medical capabilities created ethical obligations that complicated tactical decisions. When American medics could save lives that other armies would consider beyond help, commanders faced difficult choices about risking additional personnel to evacuate casualties who might survive with proper treatment. These moral complexities, unknown to previous generations of military leaders, reflected the double-edged nature of medical advancement that created both opportunities and obligations unprecedented in warfare. German soldiers, witnessing American medical capabilities through prisoner exchanges and battlefield encounters, faced psychological challenges that undermined their willingness to continue fighting. Knowing that capture by American forces meant access to medical care superior to what their own army provided, created incentives for surrender that German commanders struggled to counter. The realization that the enemy valued German lives more than the Wehrmacht leadership did proved profoundly demoralizing and contributed to the collapse of German fighting spirit in the war's final stages. The enemy perspective revealed German reactions that ranged from professional admiration to existential despair, as Wehrmacht medical officers witnessed American capabilities that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of military logistics. German Army medical reports from the Holland campaign described American medical operations with clinical detachment that barely concealed profound shock at capabilities they had never imagined possible. These reports, circulated among German medical headquarters, described American field hospitals that appeared within hours of airborne landings and performed surgical procedures that German military doctrine considered impossible outside permanent medical facilities. German medical officers trained in the Prussian military tradition understood medical care as a secondary consideration, subordinate to tactical necessity. They viewed American medical deployments as evidence of wasteful resource allocation that weakened overall combat effectiveness by diverting assets from primary combat missions. This philosophical difference created cognitive dissonance when German observers witnessed American medical capabilities that not only failed to weaken American combat effectiveness, but actually enhanced it by providing soldiers with confidence that wounds would not mean death or permanent disability. The psychological warfare angle emerged as German soldiers increasingly recognized that American medical superiority offered better treatment than their own army provided. German intelligence reports documented declining morale as Wehrmacht personnel learned about American medical capabilities through battlefield encounters and prisoner exchanges. German soldiers began to view capture by American forces as preferable to evacuation through German medical systems that lacked adequate supplies, personnel, or facilities to provide effective treatment for serious injuries. This psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers to affect German command decisions at every level. German commanders found themselves forced to allocate disproportionate resources to medical evacuation and treatment as their soldiers' confidence in Wehrmacht medical care declined. Units that might once have fought desperately to avoid capture now showed increasing willingness to surrender when faced with overwhelming odds, knowing that American captivity meant better medical care than the German army could provide its own wounded. The strategic angle revealed how American medical superiority translated into tactical advantages that German commanders failed to anticipate. American soldiers fought with greater aggressiveness when they knew that wounds would receive immediate, expert treatment that maximized survival chances and minimized permanent disability. This confidence allowed American commanders to take tactical risks that German forces, aware of their own medical limitations, could not match without accepting casualties that would prove prohibitively expensive in both human and material terms. German tactical doctrine, developed during years of successful offensive operations, assumed that battlefield medical care would remain limited to basic first aid and evacuation to rear-area hospitals. When confronted with American forces supported by advanced medical capabilities deployed directly to combat zones, German tactical assumptions proved obsolete. American forces could sustain combat operations in locations where German doctrine insisted adequate medical support was impossible, creating tactical situations for which German commanders had no doctrinal solutions. The propaganda angle demonstrated how both sides struggled to exploit medical superiority for psychological warfare purposes. American propaganda emphasized medical achievements as evidence of superior American values that prioritized individual human life over military expediency. These messages, broadcast throughout occupied Europe, highlighted the contrast between American medical care that saved enemy wounded and German practices that increasingly abandoned their own soldiers to preventable deaths. The effectiveness of this propaganda campaign appeared in German prisoner interrogation reports that frequently mentioned American medical care as a factor influencing surrender decisions. German propaganda, meanwhile, attempted to portray American medical capabilities as evidence of American weakness and overindulgence that diverted resources from essential combat missions. German propagandists argued that American medical deployments demonstrated soft American values inappropriate for the harsh realities of modern warfare. But these messages failed to resonate with German soldiers, who increasingly viewed American medical superiority as evidence of superior overall military capability rather than misplaced priorities. The innovation angle showcased American technological and organizational advantages that German forces could not replicate even when they understood their importance. American medical innovations resulted from systematic research and development programs that integrated civilian medical advances with military requirements through unprecedented cooperation between academic, industrial, and military institutions. This collaborative approach produced medical technologies and techniques that German research, fragmented by institutional rivalries and resource shortages, could not match despite individual brilliance among German medical researchers. The cumulative effect of these multiple angles created a psychological and practical supremacy that extended far beyond the immediate medical benefits to wounded soldiers. American medical superiority became a symbol of overall American military capability that demoralized German forces while inspiring confidence among Allied troops and occupied populations who recognized American medical achievements as evidence of inevitable Allied victory. At precisely 1:31 p.m. on September 17, 1944, the largest medical airlift in military history began descending toward the Dutch countryside near Zaan. The first wave of 6 CG-4A gliders carrying the 3 and 26th Airborne Medical Company's advance teams released from their C-47 tow lines at 1,500 feet, beginning silent approaches toward landing zones that German defenders had assumed were beyond the reach of sophisticated medical support. The gliders descended at 400 feet per minute, their fabric-covered wooden frames carrying cargo that would fundamentally alter the nature of battlefield medicine. German observation posts throughout the sector reported the glider landings with growing confusion as intelligence officers struggled to categorize the unprecedented equipment emerging from the crashed aircraft. Through field glasses, Wehrmacht observers watched American personnel unloading surgical tables, electronic equipment, and medical supplies in quantities that defied every assumption about airborne logistics. Within 30 minutes of landing, American medics had established treatment stations capable of performing surgery that German doctrine insisted required permanent hospital facilities and uninterrupted supply lines. Obergefreiter Klaus Brenner, watching from his observation post in the Zaan church tower, transmitted reports to German headquarters that his superiors initially dismissed as battlefield hysteria. Brenner described Icons assembling complete surgical suites in open fields, powered by portable generators that provided electricity for lighting and medical equipment. His detailed descriptions of American medical capabilities read like science fiction to German officers trained to consider forward medical care limited to basic first aid and morphine injections. The second wave of 54 gliders arrived at 2:40 p.m., transforming the initial American medical presence into something that overwhelmed German comprehension. Wehrmacht intelligence had prepared for American combat units, artillery positions, and supply depots, but no German planning had anticipated the deployment of complete hospitals capable of performing major surgery within hours of landing. The psychological impact on German defenders proved as significant as the practical medical benefits for American forces. German radio intercepts revealed the growing panic among Wehrmacht medical officers as they realized the implications of American medical superiority. German medical units, already struggling with critical shortages of personnel, supplies, and equipment, faced the prospect of treating German casualties with primitive methods while watching American forces deploy medical capabilities that surpassed many civilian hospitals. The contrast became even more stark when German medical officers learned that American field hospitals were treating German prisoners with better care than the Wehrmacht could provide its own wounded. The establishment of the American field hospital at Zahn proceeded with mechanical precision that reflected months of intensive training and preparation. By 5:00 p.m., less than 4 hours after the first gliders landed, American surgeons were performing their first operations in sterile environments that maintained civilian hospital standards under combat conditions. The speed and efficiency of this deployment shocked German observers who had assumed that sophisticated medical care required weeks of preparation and permanent infrastructure. German attempts to disrupt American medical operations revealed the tactical implications of superior medical support. Wehrmacht artillery strikes against American medical positions triggered responses that demonstrated the integration between American combat and medical units. American artillery immediately countered German fire while air support provided cover for medical operations, illustrating how American medical superiority enhanced overall combat effectiveness rather than weakening it through resource diversion. The psychological warfare aspect of American medical operations became apparent as German soldiers witnessed treatment standards that exceeded anything available within the Wehrmacht medical system. German prisoners received immediate medical attention that included pain relief, proper wound dressing, and surgical treatment when necessary. These prisoners, upon return to German lines through prisoner exchanges, carried descriptions of American medical capabilities that spread throughout German units and contributed to declining morale as soldiers realized their own army could not provide comparable care. German medical officers filed reports with their superiors describing American medical capabilities in terms that barely concealed their professional admiration and personal despair. Dr. Heinrich Müller's report to Wehrmacht Medical Headquarters described American surgical techniques and equipment that he recognized as advances his own medical education had never encompassed. Müller's clinical descriptions revealed the psychological burden placed on German medical personnel forced to watch patients die from conditions that American medical capabilities could easily treat. The tactical situation around Zahn evolved rapidly as American medical superiority influenced combat decisions on both sides. American commanders could commit forces to aggressive actions knowing that casualties would receive immediate, expert treatment that maximized survival chances and minimized permanent disabilities. German commanders, meanwhile, faced the psychological burden of ordering attacks that would produce casualties their own medical system could not adequately treat, while knowing that American medical capabilities offered better care to enemy prisoners than the Wehrmacht provided its own soldiers. By nightfall on September 17th, the American medical deployment at Zahn had established capabilities that German intelligence analysts would later describe as impossible under previously understood principles of military logistics. The 326th Airborne Medical Company had proven that advanced medical care could be delivered anywhere airborne forces could land, eliminating traditional assumptions about the relationship between medical capability and logistical infrastructure. This demonstration would reshape military medical doctrine and create psychological effects that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Holland. The German High Command's reaction to reports from Holland reflected institutional shock that extended beyond tactical surprise to challenge fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. General Kurt Student's headquarters received detailed intelligence reports describing American medical capabilities that seemed to violate basic principles of military logistics, but the consistency and detail of multiple independent sources forced German commanders to accept that American airborne forces possessed medical support capabilities unprecedented in military history. Wehrmacht medical headquarters convened emergency conferences to assess the implications of American medical superiority for German defensive operations throughout occupied Europe. The realization that American forces could deploy complete hospitals anywhere airborne operations could reach created strategic problems that German commanders had never anticipated. Traditional German defensive strategies relied on the assumption that enemy forces operating behind German lines would suffer from inadequate medical support, but American capabilities eliminated this assumed advantage. The psychological impact on German medical personnel proved equally significant as the tactical implications for combat operations. German medical officers, trained in military traditions that emphasized duty above individual welfare, found themselves confronting evidence that their enemies valued German lives more than the Wehrmacht leadership valued German soldiers. This realization created moral conflicts that undermined the ideological foundations of German military service and contributed to the collapse of German fighting spirit in the war's final phases. German prisoner interrogation reports from the Holland campaign revealed systematic changes in German soldier attitudes toward surrender and capture. Wehrmacht personnel increasingly viewed capture by American forces as preferable to evacuation through German medical systems that lacked adequate supplies, personnel, or facilities to provide effective treatment. This psychological shift represented a strategic defeat that complemented tactical reverses on the battlefield and accelerated the collapse of German resistance. The attempted German counterattacks against American medical positions at Zon demonstrated the tactical integration between American combat and medical units that German planners had failed to anticipate. When Wehrmacht forces targeted American field hospitals, expecting easy victories against non-combatant medical personnel, they encountered coordinated defensive operations that included immediate artillery support, air cover, and rapid reinforcement by combat units. These defensive operations revealed that American medical superiority enhanced, rather than weakened, overall combat effectiveness. German artillery strikes against the American medical complex at Zon triggered responses that illustrated American tactical doctrines designed to protect medical assets. American counter-battery fire, coordinated through advanced fire control systems, suppressed German artillery positions within minutes of their first salvos. American air support arrived with response times that German observers had never witnessed, providing close air support that effectively neutralized German attempts to disrupt American medical operations through indirect fire. The German ground assault against American medical positions on September 19th produced results that shocked Wehrmacht commanders throughout the sector. German infantry, expecting to overrun medical personnel with minimal resistance, encountered coordinated defensive fire from American medics trained as combat soldiers, as well as dedicated security units positioned to protect medical facilities. The assault failed with casualties that German commanders could not adequately treat, while American medical units continued operations throughout the engagement. German medical officers observing American treatment of German prisoners documented care standards that exceeded anything available within the Wehrmacht medical system. German wounded received immediate pain relief, proper wound cleaning and dressing, surgical treatment when necessary, and post-operative care that included adequate nutrition and nursing attention. These treatment standards, documented in German medical reports, provided evidence of American medical superiority that German propaganda could not effectively counter. The broader implications of American medical superiority became apparent as German commanders throughout Holland adjusted their tactical planning to account for American capabilities they had never anticipated. German defensive operations, previously designed to inflict casualties that would degrade American combat effectiveness over time, proved counterproductive when American medical capabilities could treat and return wounded soldiers to duty within days or weeks rather than accepting them as permanent losses. German intelligence analysis of American medical operations revealed organizational and technological advantages that the Wehrmacht could not replicate even when they understood their importance. American medical units operated with supply systems that delivered necessary materials without regard to ground transportation vulnerabilities that plagued German medical logistics. American medical equipment incorporated technological advances that German industry, isolated by war and starved of resources, could no longer match or counter. The psychological warfare implications of American medical superiority extended beyond immediate tactical considerations to influence German civilian morale and political calculations. German civilians in occupied territories, witnessing American medical care provided to German prisoners and civilians, began to view American occupation as preferable to continued German rule. This psychological shift contributed to the collapse of German authority in occupied regions and accelerated the disintegration of German resistance. By September 20th, German commanders throughout Holland faced the reality that American medical superiority represented a strategic advantage they could not counter through conventional military means. The deployment of complete hospitals by airborne operations had eliminated traditional assumptions about medicine, logistics that German defensive planning had incorporated as permanent factors. German forces now confronted American capabilities that enhanced enemy combat effectiveness while providing better care to German prisoners than the Wehrmacht could offer its own soldiers, creating psychological conditions that made continued resistance increasingly difficult to justify or sustain. The immediate aftermath of the American medical deployment at Zoen created psychological shockwaves that extended throughout German forces in Holland and beyond. Wehrmacht intelligence reports documented systematic changes in German soldier behavior that reflected growing awareness of American medical superiority over German capabilities. German units reported increasing incidents of soldiers deliberately seeking capture by American forces when wounded, recognizing that American medical care offered better survival chances than evacuation through German medical systems struggling with critical shortages of personnel, supplies, and equipment. German medical officers filed detailed reports describing American medical capabilities with clinical precision that barely concealed their professional despair. Dr. Heinrich Muller's assessment of American surgical equipment and techniques revealed technological and organizational advantages that German medical units could not match even when they understood their importance. Muller's reports, circulated among Wehrmacht medical headquarters, described American medical innovations that seemed to violate fundamental assumptions about battlefield medicine, including portable X-ray machines, advanced surgical instruments, and pharmaceutical supplies that German medical units had not seen since the war's early phases. The psychological impact on German medical personnel proved as significant as the practical implications for combat operations. German medical officers, trained in military traditions that emphasized efficiency and resource conservation, found themselves confronting evidence that American medical doctrine prioritized individual human life over tactical considerations. This philosophical difference created moral conflicts that undermined the ideological foundations of German military service and contributed to declining morale throughout the Wehrmacht medical establishment. American medical operations at Zoen continued to expand in scope and sophistication as additional supplies and personnel arrived through both airborne delivery and ground transportation along the corridor established by Operation Market Garden. By September 25th, the 326th Airborne Medical Company had treated over 500 casualties, including American soldiers, British troops, Dutch civilians, and German prisoners, maintaining treatment standards that German observers recognized as superior to civilian hospitals in many German cities. The consistency and quality of American medical care created a demonstration of American capabilities that proved more effective than conventional propaganda. The integration between American combat and medical operations revealed tactical doctrines that German commanders had never encountered and could not effectively counter. American medical units operated with security arrangements that included dedicated combat personnel, coordinated artillery support, and air cover that responded to threats against medical facilities with overwhelming force. These protective measures allowed American medical operations to continue under combat conditions that would have forced German medical units to evacuate or cease operations entirely. German attempts to exploit American medical operations as tactical opportunities consistently failed as Wehrmacht commanders discovered that American medical assets were protected by defensive arrangements more sophisticated than many German combat positions. German artillery strikes against American medical facilities triggered counter-battery responses that neutralized German firing positions within minutes, while German ground attacks encountered defensive fire from American medics trained as combat soldiers, supported by dedicated security units positioned specifically to protect medical operations. The treatment of German prisoners by American medical units created psychological warfare effects that German commanders struggled to counter through conventional means. German prisoners received medical care that exceeded Wehrmacht standards, including adequate pain relief, proper wound treatment, and post-operative care that German medical units could no longer provide their own wounded. These prisoners, upon return to German lines through exchanges, carried testimonials about American medical capabilities that spread throughout German units and contributed to declining resistance morale. The expansion of American medical capabilities beyond the initial zone deployment demonstrated logistics capabilities that German intelligence had never anticipated. American medical supply systems delivered equipment and materials to forward positions without dependence on ground transportation routes vulnerable to German interdiction. This supply independence allowed American medical operations to continue at full capacity regardless of tactical situations that would have crippled German medical units dependent on vulnerable ground supply lines. German medical doctrine, developed during years of offensive operations when battlefield medicine remained secondary to tactical concide. Rations proved inadequate for defensive operations, where medical superiority provided decisive advantages to enemy forces. German commanders found themselves forced to allocate disproportionate resources to protecting their own limited medical assets while watching American medical capabilities enhance enemy combat effectiveness through superior treatment of casualties and psychological confidence provided to American soldiers. The broader strategic implications of American medical superiority became apparent as German resistance throughout Holland began to collapse under psychological pressure created by the contrast between American and German medical capabilities. German soldiers increasingly recognized that American medical care offered better treatment than their own army provided, creating incentives for surrender that German commanders could not counter through traditional military discipline or ideological indoctrination. This psychological shift represented a strategic defeat that complemented tactical reverses and accelerated the disintegration of German defensive positions throughout the sector. The long-term transformation of military medical doctrine began immediately as American medical achievements in Holland demonstrated capabilities that military theorists had considered impossible under combat conditions. The successful deployment of complete hospitals by airborne operations eliminated traditional assumptions about the relationship between medical capability and logistical infrastructure, proving that advanced medical care could be delivered anywhere military forces could operate. This demonstration reshaped military medical planning throughout the Allied forces and influenced post-war military doctrine development that incorporated medical superiority as a fundamental component of combat effectiveness. German military medical services entered a period of systematic collapse as resource shortages combined with psychological demoralization created by awareness of American medical superiority. Wehrmacht medical units, already struggling with critical personnel and supply shortages, faced additional challenges as German medical officers increasingly questioned the moral foundations of military service that provided better care to enemy prisoners than to German soldiers. This psychological crisis contributed to the broader collapse of German military effectiveness and accelerated the disintegration of Wehrmacht resistance throughout occupied Europe. The psychological warfare implications of American medical superiority extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to influence German civilian populations and political calculations throughout occupied territories. German civilians witnessing American medical care provided to German prisoners and wounded civilians began to view American occupation as preferable to continued German rule. This psychological shift contributed to the collapse of German authority in occupied regions and facilitated Allied military operations through reduced civilian resistance and increased cooperation with Allied forces. American medical innovations developed for airborne operations found immediate applications throughout Allied military operations in Europe and the Pacific. The techniques and equipment perfected by the 326th Airborne Medical Company influenced medical support for conventional infantry operations, armored divisions, and special operations forces. These innovations, disseminated through Allied medical networks, enhanced casualty survival rates and combat effectiveness across all Allied military services, creating medical advantages that Axis forces could not match or counter. The industrial implications of American medical superiority demonstrated the decisive importance of technological innovation and production capacity in modern warfare. American pharmaceutical companies, medical equipment manufacturers, and research institutions had created medical capabilities that German industry, isolated by war and starved of resources, could no longer match despite individual brilliance among German researchers and medical professionals. This industrial superiority provided Americans with medical advantages that enhanced combat effectiveness while demonstrating overall national capability that influenced neutral nations and enemy populations. German post-war military analyses identified American medical superiority as a decisive factor in Allied victory that German military planning had failed to anticipate or counter. German military historians recognized that American medical capabilities had provided psychological and practical advantages that enhanced Allied combat effectiveness while undermining German morale and resistance capacity. These analyses influenced post-war German military doctrine and contributed to NATO medical standards that incorporated American innovations developed during World War II. The transformation of battlefield medicine initiated by American airborne medical operations continued to evolve throughout the remaining months of World War II and influenced military medical doctrine for decades afterward. The principles demonstrated by the 326th Airborne Medical Company, rapid deployment of advanced medical capabilities, integration between combat and medical operations, and emphasis on individual soldier welfare became fundamental components of modern military medical doctrine adopted by military forces throughout the world. The psychological impact of American medical superiority persisted long after the immediate tactical situation in Holland resolved itself through Allied victory. German veterans of the Holland campaign carried memories of American medical capabilities that influenced their post-war attitudes toward American military power and democratic values. These psychological effects contributed to successful Allied occupation policies and facilitated the reconstruction of democratic institutions in post-war Germany through demonstrated evidence of American values that prioritized human life over military expediency. American medical achievements in Holland provided concrete evidence of democratic values translated into practical military capabilities that enhanced rather than weakened combat effectiveness. This demonstration proved particularly influential among neutral nations and resistance movements throughout occupied Europe, who recognized American medical capabilities as evidence of superior national values and inevitable Allied victory. The psychological impact of American medical superiority thus extended beyond immediate military considerations to influence political developments that shaped the post-war world order. The legacy of American airborne medical operations in Holland continued to influence military medical doctrine, international humanitarian law, and civilian medical practice for decades after World War II ended. The innovations developed by American military medical personnel found applications in civilian hospitals, emergency medical services, and disaster relief operations, demonstrating how military medical advances could benefit civilian populations while maintaining military advantages. This dual-purpose capability illustrated the fundamental compatibility between American democratic values and military effectiveness that proved decisive in achieving victory over totalitarian enemies who viewed individual human life as expendable for political purposes. The morning of September 18, 1944, revealed a transformed battlefield where the ancient relationship between warfare and human suffering had been fundamentally altered by American innovation and determination. The success of the 326th Airborne Medical Company represented more than tactical victory or technological achievement. It demonstrated how democratic values could be translated into military capabilities that enhanced, rather than compromised, combat effectiveness. The sight of American medics saving German lives with greater dedication than the Wehrmacht showed its own soldiers proved more devastating to enemy morale than conventional military defeats. The psychological impact of American medical superiority extended beyond immediate military considerations to challenge fundamental assumptions about the nature of modern warfare itself. Previous generations of military leaders had accepted massive casualty rates as inevitable costs of victory, but American medical capabilities proved that technological innovation and humanitarian values could reduce human suffering while simultaneously enhancing military effectiveness. This demonstration provided concrete evidence that democratic nations possessed inherent advantages over totalitarian enemies who treated individual human life as expendable for political purposes. The German officers who witnessed American medical operations carried memories that would influence their understanding of American power long after military defeat ended their resistance. They had seen evidence of national capabilities that extended far beyond industrial production or military technology to encompass values and priorities that created practical advantages on the battlefield. The realization that their enemies valued German lives more than German leadership valued German soldiers proved more demoralizing than tactical defeats and contributed to the psychological collapse that preceded military surrender. The legacy of American airborne medical operations in Holland continued to resonate throughout the post-war world as medical innovations developed for military purposes found applications in civilian healthcare, emergency medical services, and disaster relief operations. The principles demonstrated by the 326th Airborne Medical Company, rapid deployment of advanced capabilities, integration between different organizational functions, and emphasis on individual human welfare, influenced not only military doctrine but civilian institutions throughout the democratic world. These innovations proved that military necessity and humanitarian values could reinforce rather than contradict each other when guided by democratic principles that recognized individual human dignity as a source of national strength rather than weakness. The transformation of battlefield medicine initiated by American forces in Holland represented a permanent change in the relationship between warfare and human suffering that continues to influence military operations and international humanitarian law today. The demonstration that advanced medical care could be delivered to any location where military forces operated eliminated traditional assumptions about the inevitable costs of warfare and created new moral obligations for military leaders who possessed capabilities to save lives that previous generations could not have imagined. This revolution in military medicine stands as lasting testimony to the power of democratic values and technological innovation to reduce human suffering while achieving military objectives that serve the cause of human freedom and dignity.